A lot of geopolitics, unusual aircraft incidents, a tragic accident and plenty of eye-catching industry news. Yeah, it is time for another monthly aviation news roundup, and October was quite a busy month for parts of our industry. We're going to start with a bit of geopolitics, which anyone watching the news lately has probably seen plenty of. But there was one story early on in October involving the United States and China that probably deserved some more attention, even when looked at from here in Europe. On October the 9th, the US president announced plans to ban Chinese airlines to overfly Russia if they were flying commercially to and from the United States. This was part of a wider trade back and forth between China and the US, and it specifically followed plans by China to introduce export controls for rare earth elements, vital for the production of aircraft, electric cars and various electronics for military and civilian use. But what would be the point of banning Chinese airlines from overflying Russia when they fly to the US? Well, since the Russia-Ukraine war led to the imposition of international sanctions in 2022, Russian airlines can't overfly most countries in Europe and the Americas, and airlines from those Western countries therefore can't overfly Russia either. Now, as I've explained in previous videos on this channel, this situation has created a lot of unfair advantage for the airlines that can still overfly Russia, like those from the Gulf countries, Turkey, India and China. These airlines can fly to and from the US and Europe without using routes that take them around Russian airspace, which allows them to fly quicker and therefore burn less fuel. And that advantage has meant that it has become uneconomical for many Western airlines to continue flying to China, since they just can't compete with their Chinese counterparts. Now, obviously, a move to stop Chinese airlines from overflying Russia when traveling to and from the US would readdress that balance immediately. And unsurprisingly, the Chinese airlines quickly reacted to this, many of them by writing to the US Department of Transport, stating that these plans would add 2 to 3 hours of flight time to their routes. They also said that if a change like that would be made now, around 2,800 passengers already booked to travel in the last couple of months of 2025 would likely need to rebook their flights in order to make their connections. Now, these arguments might not be as effective as the Chinese airlines actually hope, because they are exactly what US airlines have been saying about being effectively locked out of China due to Russia's airspace closures. And that's also why trade groups representing US airlines support this measure. Now, interestingly, airlines in Europe also support it, because if you look at the map, you'll see that European airlines wanting to fly to China have to make even bigger route deviations than those that the US airlines are facing. So the CEOs of Air France and Lufthansa have also backed the US proposal, saying that the present situation basically amounts to a gift to Chinese airlines. But as of now, the European authorities doesn't seem to be looking at implementing similar measures themselves, so this is a story that's worth keeping an eye on. Up next are a couple of aviation mishaps, the first of which unfortunately included loss of life. This happened to Emirates Flight 9788, a cargo flight that was performed using a wet-leased Boeing 747 freighter operated by the Turkish-based company AirACT. This flight departed normally from Dubai, heading for Hong Kong's international airport, where its crew subsequently got cleared to land using runway 07 left and touched down at 03:53 AM local time. Now, as we record this, there is no official explanation to what happened next, but shortly after the aircraft touched down, GPS data shows that it veered off the centerline to the left, while it was still rolling at high speed. Tragically, after then leaving the runway, the aircraft crossed an access road where 2 airport workers happened to be crossing by in their patrol car. The 747 hit that vehicle and dragged it along as it plunged into the sea just beyond the road. It ended up partially submerged after finally coming to a stop with severe damage to its fuselage, but all 4 crew members in the aircraft were soon rescued. Unfortunately though, the 2 airport workers in the ground vehicle, aged 30 and 41 years old, died in the accident, and their vehicle was later found submerged at a depth of 7 meters. This accident is now under investigation by the Hong Kong Air Accident Investigation Authority with the help from other agencies including the NTSB, and this is only the second ever deadly accident to happen at this airport since it opened for operations in 1998. Now the next story is also an aviation incident, one with no fatalities but at least one injury. On the 16th of October, a United Airlines Boeing 737 MAX operating flight 1093 from Denver to Los Angeles suddenly hit an object while it was cruising merrily along at 36,000 feet. This incident happened around 40 minutes into the flight, and initially at least, many reports in the media suggested that the culprit could have been either some sort of meteorite or maybe even space debris, since it's almost unheard of to encounter birds at that altitude. Whatever it was, pictures showed that the object shattered the outer pane of the windshield on the first officer's side as well as the inner pane, and a lot of shards also hit the crew, with one photo showing the captain's right arm covered in nasty cuts. Obviously, the crew then quickly started to descend and ultimately diverted to Salt Lake City, where they landed safely on runway 16 left about 45 minutes after hitting that mystery object. But what was it that they actually hit? Well, my personal guess, which I shared with my Patreons in a Zoom call, was that this was probably a weather balloon. But as far as I know, the first person to guess the specific culprit was Scott Manley over on X. Because it turns out that this was indeed a weather balloon, but a somewhat unusual one. You see, most of those type of balloons are released and then fly up more or less vertically until they burst and then fall back down again. But it looks like the one that the United crew hit was a wind-borne systems weather balloon. And these instead climb and descend multiple times, sometimes remaining airborne for over a month, which makes them much more useful in their job. Unfortunately though, as this incident clearly shows, this could make their location a bit harder to predict, although they do actually report their position continuously. Now these probes weigh around 2.4 pounds, or just over a kilo, and they then get lighter as time goes by when they release their ballast, which is sand. Now Windborne quickly confirmed that they also believe that one of their balloons was involved in this event, and in a later statement they said that they're working together with the FAA and the NTSB to investigate the incident. And they have also immediately reprogrammed their balloons to not spend a lot of time at aircraft's cruising altitudes between 30 and 40,000 feet. They're also reportedly working on plans to make the balloons being able to autonomously avoid the aircraft, presumably by using ADS-B data. In any case, the United crew didn't face life-threatening injuries and their aircraft returned to service reasonably quickly. But what I think is really amazing about this story is that despite the shattered panes on both sides of the windshields, the middle pane held firm and the aircraft remained pressurized. So that means that the laminate construction of the window still did its job, which for us pilots is really reassuring. But it was how the investigators communicated these interim findings that caused strong reactions from many sides. And that actually brings us to a really important point, because how something is reported can create vastly different reactions. And speaking of staying up to date with aviation stories, when you do, it's always interesting to see just how differently they can be covered depending on where you read them. And that's exactly where today's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. They are an app and a website that bring together thousands of stories from outlets around the world, showing how coverage differs across political bias, factual reliability and ownership, so that you can see the real full picture. Take this weather balloon story for example. It's been reported by over 100 different sources, but what each outlet chooses to focus on really depends. And what's really interesting with this one was that when the story first broke, many outlets ran with that space debris angle. But only a very few then followed up when it turned out to be a weather balloon. And it was mostly center-leaning outlets who did, which you could easily see using Ground News. For example, right-leaning outlets like the Washington Times emphasizes risks and potential fault, framing the event as a serious safety incident. whilst left-leaning sources like the Colorado Sun focuses on the technical details like the cracked windshield and the sequence of events rather than assigning blame. So if you want the full picture, not just one side of it, I highly recommend you to check out ground.news/mentor. Scan this QR code or hit the link in the description. You'll get 40% off the plan that I use. That's just $5 per month for a limited time. Big thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this episode and supporting the channel. Now let's continue. Our next story covers something that actually came out in the end of September, but too late for us to cover in our previous monthly news roundup. The Wall Street Journal reported that Boeing has now begun work on a replacement aircraft design for the 737 MAX. And according to that article, despite previous plans for more unorthodox designs, this 737 replacement will be a single-aisle aircraft, so very similar in architecture to the short and medium-haul aircraft that we all know today. Now that's a little bit interesting in itself, because previous reports had indicated that Boeing was exploring a few more exotic ideas, like the transonic truss-braced wing design that they were previously developing together with NASA. The Wall Street Journal also had some quite interesting news about engines. Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg reportedly recently travelled to the UK to visit Rolls-Royce's factory in Derby and talked with Rolls-Royce's CEO Tufan Ergin-Bilgic about engines for a narrow-body jet. Now, that happened already back in February, but had not been known until now. For any new narrow-body, or really any new airliner to make sense, it needs to be considerably more efficient than its predecessor, at least to the tune of 15 to 20%. Now, Rolls-Royce claimed that its UltraFan will be at least 10% more efficient than the latest single-aisle jet engines that we now use, and that the total efficiency could jump to 20% if combined with airframe design upgrades like lightweight composites and new wings. Now, we already knew that Rolls-Royce have been working on a new prototype of their UltraFan engine, this time sized for a narrow-body aircraft, and with these news it seems like they could finally have found a customer for it. Or have they? Well, not everyone agrees about how promising or new these news actually are. Scott Hamilton in Liam News pointed out that it would be unthinkable for Boeing to not be working on something to replace the 737, but that doesn't actually mean that a program launch is imminent. And indeed, more recent comments from Boeing, and actually from Airbus as well, confirm that neither of them is really interested in launching something new just yet. They both have large aircraft order backlogs to worry about, and Boeing still has 737 MAX variants still to certify. But they are obviously both keeping an eye on what type of technologies are available out there, in case they would actually be working on something. Scott Hamilton also pointed out that Boeing and Rolls-Royce have many other projects to talk about beyond the future 737 replacement, but I will probably look at that in a little bit more detail in a separate video, so stay tuned. Meanwhile, and despite their many headaches, Boeing got some news in October that really should give them reason to celebrate. They now have FAA approval to produce 42 737 MAXes per month, up from 38 aircraft before. That previous limit came in the aftermath of the Alaska Airlines door plug blowout scandal in January of 2024, and moving past that limit safely has been a key target for Boeing ever since. As I have already talked about, Boeing has taken a very measured approach to raising this limit by first making sure that their suppliers were ready for it months in advance. And that's because they had to convince the FAA that they could work at this rate safely, even with minor hiccups in supply chain and production. And it now looks like they've ticked all of those FAA boxes off successfully. Some Boeing customers like Ryanair have said that they expect Boeing to get approvals to make as many as 48 737 MAXes per month by April of 2026 if all goes well. And I suppose that eventually, if Boeing keeps improving to FAA satisfaction, that production limit will likely be removed altogether. In September this year, Boeing ended up delivering 55 aircraft, up from 33 jets in September of 2024, but that year's output was obviously affected by the 2024 workers' strike. However, this September's 55 deliveries happened just as Boeing got rid of its last stored 737 MAXes in the desert, so everything that they deliver from now on will be completely newly produced jets. And speaking of strikes, as we are recording this video, this year's strike of Boeing's defense workers is still ongoing. The 3,200 workers at Boeing's San Luis facilities, who mainly makes fighter jets and munitions, have now been on strike since the 4th of August. Some mediation between the two sides is underway, but this could still take a lot more time to fix. And there are now also reports that the strike is affecting the delivery schedule of new F-15EX fighter jets to the US Air Force. For our next story, we'll go back to Airbus and a bit back to geopolitics, but this time the very quiet and diplomatic variant. You see, on Wednesday the 22nd of October, Airbus inaugurated its second final assembly line, or FAL, for Airbus A320neo aircraft in their facility in Tianjin, China. This was a big deal because increasing assembly capacity is vital in order for Airbus to reach its ambitious production targets. But you wouldn't have thought that this was a particularly important milestone by looking at the inauguration ceremony. Reuters pointed out that when Airbus opened their first line in Tianjin 15 years ago, there were 600 guests present in a lavish international ceremony. But this time, no media from outside of China was even allowed to attend. So why was that? Well, it could have something to do with the fact that just over a week earlier, Airbus had inaugurated another FAL, their second one for the Airbus A320neo in Mobile, Alabama, in the United States. With these new FALs, plus renovations to their existing assembly lines, Airbus will now have 10 FALs worldwide for the Airbus A321neo family, enabling them to reach production rates of 75 aircraft per month by 2027. But as you probably guessed, Airbus now has to walk a fine line between the US and China. Sanctions and tariffs aren't out of the news cycle yet, and Airbus are still negotiating a reported contract with several Chinese airlines for as many as 500 new aircraft. By the way, Boeing are also in negotiations for a potential 500 aircraft contract with China, as we mentioned in a previous news roundup actually, and geopolitics have been keeping that one stalled as well. So there is a lot hanging in the balance here, and Airbus has to be very careful with how they deal with their airline customers, both in the US and in China, as well as with the two countries in general. Next, I want to cover the bankruptcy of an airline, one which seems to follow a pretty strange pattern. In late September, Play Airlines ceased all their operations and simultaneously cancelled all of their flights. And they were based in Iceland and weren't the first airline from there to go bankrupt lately. The idea behind Play was pretty straightforward. Iceland is about halfway between mainland Europe and North America, and not only that, the country is also situated almost directly under a lot of the airways connecting Europe with America. So an airline based in Iceland should therefore be able to use single-aisle jets to fly to both continents, and with the lower operating costs of those jets, they could then theoretically connect a variety of destinations across the Atlantic with lower operating costs than airlines in the US or in mainland Europe ever could. And sure enough, around 40% of Play's customers actually used Iceland as a stop, not as their origin or destination. So this was an elegant idea, and not really a unique one. Other airlines have tried to do the same, from Alaska, for example, to connect the US with countries in Asia. And of course, by using Reykjavik in Iceland as a hub, a lot of passengers could then also take advantage of the stop to spend some time there, boosting the country's own economy. Pretty awesome. Well, at least that's what Play set out to do as a low-cost carrier, and it sadly didn't work. The airline started operations in 2021, but already in 2024 things started to look a bit bleak. The airline then drastically reduced its US destinations down to 3: New York, Stewart, Boston, Logan, and Baltimore, Washington. And they also cut many of their links to Northern Europe, instead focusing on sunshine European destinations further south. And maybe more worryingly, the airline also gave up its Icelandic Air Operator certificate, re-registering their jets under a new AOC in Malta. And even later, the company tried shifting parts of its operation into a kind of wet lease model, leasing 6 out of its 10 planes out to other airlines. But at that point, it was already too late. With dwindling finances, the airline had to stop operating on the 29th of September, which meant that its 400 employees lost their jobs. And on top of that, around 1,750 passengers were immediately affected, with 18,000 others expecting to travel in the days that was following. So why did they fail then? Well, the honest answer here is that we don't really know yet. But like I said earlier, this seems to be part of a pattern. Play's story mirrored that of WOW Air, which was also an aspiring low-cost carrier from Iceland who failed back in 2019 under similar circumstances. Both airlines had also made some bold fleet choices. WOW chose to operate with both narrow bodies and wide bodies, which likely complicated its operation considerably. And Play stuck to narrow bodies, but all of those were newer Airbus A320neos and 321neo models, which often comes with higher lease costs. And that can make things very unforgiving if the airline can't fill those planes throughout the year. Now, there is obviously much more to cover here, including the rising demand for premium travel and the revenue that the airlines gain from that, especially in long-haul travel. But again, there are rarely any easy answers in stories like these, and I'm thinking about looking a little bit deeper into it. Finally, we also have to mention the US government shutdown, which I've covered in a recent video, so I won't go into full details here. But as we record this video, it is still unresolved, which means that a lot of key workers in air traffic control and TSA at the airports remain unpaid. In total, 60,000 aviation safety-related workers are affected, according to recent reports. And yes, I know that some of you in the comments of my previous video pointed out that these workers will get back pay when this mess is over, which of course has happened previously. But that doesn't really change the fact that these workers likely have arranged their lives around their monthly paychecks, so just skipping one of those is not really a small deal. Another issue with getting a large lump sum in back pay is that this is then often taxed at a higher bracket, meaning that these workers might not be made whole until they get their tax refund sometime next year. So this should not be taken lightly. As we record this, they have now spent 3 weeks working without pay, with many having to take expensive loans to pay their bills. Some are also calling in sick to get temporary work somewhere else, and for their sake and those in non-key positions who were furloughed, I really hope that this matter is resolved soon. As I said in the start, a lot has happened this month, but did I miss a story that any one of you thought that I should have covered? Let me know in the comments here below. Now, if you like this kind of content, you should also check out my podcast with Ben over on the Captain Speaking channel, where we look at current stories from a pilot's perspective and also answer your questions. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.